Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we'll get started. I have a very brief intro here. Um, so welcome everyone to the third meeting of the Ethics of Human Extinction Reading Group. Um, just want to let you know that this session is being recorded. If you have a question during the Q&A, which I very much hope that you do, but don't want your voice or face to be included in the video, please just let me know in the chat or via email, and I have no problem at all just removing your question and just replacing it with text. So just let me know. I don't want the fact that this is being recorded to deter anyone from asking the question. So I'm incredibly excited to introduce Dr. Richard Pettigrew, professor of philosophy at the University of Bristol. He'll be talking about his recent paper in The Monist titled "Should Long-Termists Recommend Hastening Extinction Rather Than Delaying It?" Upcoming talks will be delivered by Les Unite, who is the founder of the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement, Federica Dalla Costa, Dr. Todd May, who has a forthcoming book, which is titled, I believe, Should We Go Extinct, or something like that, and Dr. Audra Mitchell, among many others. So you can find all this information on the reading group website. So without further delay, I will hand the stage over to Dr. Pettigrew. And once again, very nice to see everybody.
All right. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for the invitation for organizing this. It's really exciting. So as Emil said, this paper came out of I'll talk a bit about this paper. I mean, so maybe a tiny amount of background. I kind of was quite taken with some of the effective altruist suggestions back in the kind of mid 2000s, and sort of, did the thing, the usual pledge and so on, and then kind of sort of roughly followed things, but from a bit of a distance for a while, and sort of approved when they started kind of moving a bit towards kind of looking at animals and paying attention to animal suffering, and then got a little bit sort of alarmed when they seemed to go towards this kind of long-termist sort of approach. And this paper basically comes out of me trying to figure out what made me kind of a fellow traveler with them until, through the health intervention stuff and the animal welfare intervention stuff, and then get off the bus, if you like, at this point. And so I started looking at kind of what the arguments for the standard sort of long-termist conclusions were. And of course, I guess everyone involved in this reading group knows that the standard one is just a very, very simple one based on a sort of expected utility argument, where both the probabilities that go into it and the utilities that go into it, everyone kind of recognizes are pretty sort of mushy. We're not going to get absolutely precise numbers here, but the rough idea is that sort of however plausibly you set the probabilities and the utilities for different future kind of outcomes for the planet or the universe, you're going to end up getting that in expectation, the thing that will do best, or the thing that will be kind of with a certain amount of money that you have to do something, is to put that money into, first of all, trying to reduce the chance of human extinction, and second, kind of conditional on humans surviving, increase the sort of utility or the welfare, or the how well things will go for those humans. So, and the idea is roughly, so that people are kind of all on the same page and know the rough argument, it's something like, look, there's a very, very long possible future for humans, either just on this planet or perhaps kind of beyond this planet, such that, if there isn't an extinction event, things will go that way. And that the population can be reasonably large at any given time. So there's a very long time period, and also population can be large at any given time. And then there's a sort of optimism about the future that comes into this argument that suggests that it's sort of likely that that future will go well for humans. There's lots of arguments kind of based on past trajectories of progress, moral progress in terms of medical, reduction in suffering, reduction in poverty, that sort of thing. So there's a kind of view that look, I think things would be likely to go well if we do survive, and we could survive for a very long time. And even if the probability of that survival is really quite small, and even if our ability to influence it with a certain kind of intervention that we have, say an amount of money that we could donate to something or a sort of initiative we could start up, even if we could only shift that probability by a very small amount, because the goodness that we might be able to shift the probability in, the goodness of the outcome that we can increase the probability of is so vast, increasing the probability by this very, very small amount is going to be an expectation, fantastically good. And one thing you might kind of think when you first hear that argument is, yeah, I mean, okay, I can see that that the future of the world might end up being wonderful for us. Maybe we've even got reason to think that's the more likely of the two kind of long survival scenarios. But surely it could also go terribly, terribly badly. You don't have to be a kind of connoisseur of science fiction to know all the different ways in which certain awful futures for humanity could kind of get locked in, and people could become, huge numbers of people could become enslaved or could be living in kind of dire situations of great suffering. So we can kind of imagine these sorts of situations. We think that sort of thing's possible. And clearly, if you work to avoiding extinction, you also work to making the probability of that go up as well. So not just by ensuring that humanity doesn't go extinct, you don't just raise the probability of the good long future, you also raise the probability of the bad long future. Now, nonetheless, I mean, things do then get a little bit subtle with the expected utility calculation. You've got to sort of ensure that you've got to kind of look at what the how bad things could go and how good things could go, and then you also have to look at how much your intervention, your kind of intervention will shift the probabilities, take the probabilities off the extinction sort of outcome, and put those probabilities onto the good long future and the bad long future, in order to ensure to reassure yourself that still in expectation, trying to stop extinction is a very important thing to do. And one way that long-termists often think about this is to say, look, we're not just trying to avoid extinction, we're trying to avoid extinction in ways that will also push us towards the good long future. So, we're not just interested in kind of of avoiding extinction, we're trying to avoid extinction and simultaneously improve the long future conditional on it happening. I should say that not everyone has been quite as attuned to that as you might actually hope. I mean, some of the suggestions for how you might avoid extinction, particularly kind of very high level surveillance suggestions, look to me like they actually make it very, very likely that we have very long bad future, since those sort of surveillance mechanisms that are supposed to be there to avoid people creating chemical weapons or whatever that's going to wipe out humanity are also the sort of thing that, if falling into the wrong hands, are exactly the sort of system that you need to say enslave people or to kind of make people's lives go terribly badly, certainly to reduce autonomy and so on. Anyway, so I don't think everyone has been quite as keyed into this possibility as perhaps they should be, but lots of people have, and they do think that you've got to make sure that when you're increasing the probability of extinction, you are ensuring that the probability that comes off the extinction event goes more onto the good long-term future than the bad one. Okay, so that's just by way of saying that's the standard sort of argument. So let's just accept that all of that runs. If you do think that you should make this choice by standard expected utility calculation, and this has sort of been just an assumption in all of these arguments, that the right thing to do morally, if you're a utilitarian or a preference satisfaction consequentialist or whatever welfare-based consequentialist, whatever your conception is, there's a kind of puzzle about axiology. There's a puzzle about, how you should say how good particular outcomes are. What determines that? Is it just human pleasure? Is it the extent to which our preferences are satisfied? Is autonomy also important? That stuff's puzzling. But once you've set that, once you've figured out what makes things good, and you've also set some probabilities for how good those things are, then it's all straightforward. You just run it through an expected utility calculation. That is, you look at each of the possible outcomes of your action, you take their value or their utility, however you've determined that, you weight each of them by the probability of that thing coming about as a result of your action, and you add up those weighted utilities. Great, that's expected utility. We're all on board with it. And people have just assumed that that's the right thing for consequentialists to do. But I think that that's not, I mean, the point of my paper in some ways is that assumption is, it's either wrong or it needs a lot more scrutiny than it's being given. So why do I think it's wrong? Well, there's a bunch of reasons to think to think that at least people do make decisions in ways that don't just go via maximizing expected utility in the way that consequentialists sometimes think they should. So there was a bunch of kind of work in the mid-20th century by economists showing that actually people take risk into account in a way that expected utility calculations don't. And essentially what that means is that if you're a kind of it's perfectly rational to be a risk-averse person, where being a risk-averse person means that you put more weight onto the kind of worst case outcomes than expected utility suggests that you should. So with expected utility, like I was saying, you look at each of the options, you take its utility, and you just weight it by the probability of it. According to these various theories of risk that people have developed, of risk-sensitive decision making, you don't just weight it by the probability, you weight it by something that depends both on the probability and in some ways how bad the outcome is. So you end up giving more weight than just the probability to the worst case outcomes and less weight to the best case outcomes. And this kind of I mean, in some ways this is super intuitive. I mean, I'm saying it's all in terms of kind of, decision theories and economists doing this, but in some ways this is kind of what explains a lot of, say, your aversion to betting in certain situations. Sometimes I will prefer a safer option than a slightly riskier option, even though in expectation the riskier option would be better. And that's just because the riskier option gives me the possibility of something good, but it also has this downside, and I'm giving more weight to that kind of bad outcome. Okay. So there's a bunch of things. The sort of famous example here is the so-called Allais preferences put forward by Maurice Allais, who's an economist in the 50s. And then there's a bunch of theories that have come out of that about rational ways to take risk into account. So John Quiggin has this one called rank-dependent expected utility theory, which Lara Bouchek has developed in a slightly different version. And then there's a version by an economist called Chu, called weighted linear utility theory. Timothy Luke Williamson and Chris Bottomley have developed that. In any case, the point is there's various formal ways to treat these. But they'll all give the following sort of result. Think about our case of extinction again. So think about me sitting here, somehow I've got my hands on £1 million or something like that, and I've got to decide where to send my money. And I'm kind of just, I'm interested, I'm a consequentialist. I want to do the moral thing. If I use expected utility theory, then I would give my money to some long-termist cause that's trying to kind of reduce the chance of human extinction and improve the lives of people who live in the long future. That's the expected utility thing to do. But if I'm a risk-averse individual, then I might think no, because it's certainly true that in expectation, doing that, I will increase the probability of the long good future. I'll also increase the probability of the long bad future by a smaller amount. And so an expectation I'll do better. But if you're a risk-averse person using one of these theories, the risk-weighted expected utility theory, or the weighted linear expected utility theory, or any of these kind of risk-sensitive decision theories, you may well end up getting the conclusion that because you should put more weight onto the bad outcome, the outcome where we do live for another billion, humanity does exist for another billion years, but it goes terribly, terribly badly. You should put more weight onto that than just the probability of it coming about. And you should give less weight to the long good future, because that's what risk-averse people do. They don't just weight the bad outcomes by the probability of them happening. They weight the bad outcomes by some function of the probability of them happening that pays attention to the fact that they're bad outcomes, and similarly for the good outcomes. And so in that case, it can easily be that, in fact, giving the money to the long-termists to try to reduce the chance of extinction would be the bad thing to do, because you would increase the chance of the long bad future. And while you would increase it less than you would with you would increase the probability of the long good future, it wouldn't be by enough to counterbalance this risk weighting that you give it. Okay. So in some ways, I'm talking about this all in terms of a kind of formal theory, but in some ways it's just a really straightforward, simple point that, look, ensuring that we survive a very long time carries big risks. You might, if you're a kind of risk neutral person, as all the long-termists tend to be, you might think, well, sure, it risks this bad outcome, also has this possibility of a good outcome, but we've done the probabilities and they've turned out to be okay. But the risk-averse person says, look, no, probabilities on their own aren't how you set your weights for these things. You do some sort of fancy calculation that pays more attention to the worst case outcomes. So there you go. You've got an argument, at least on certain quite natural decision theories. Better thing to do. Well, it wouldn't necessarily be better to try to reduce the probability of extinction. That is, to kind of try to ensure the long future for humanity. I thought, when I came into this project, oh, well, what we'll end up getting as a conclusion of all of this is what you should do instead is give your money to the health interventions that, I always liked about effective altruism, and or the animal welfare interventions, or the education interventions, whatever the ones that the kind of what I think of as kind of old school effective altruist interventions that I liked. Thought, wow, that's what it'll tell you. Actually, turns out that's not quite true. Things go a bit hairier than that. That what this tells you is that because reducing the chance, just in the same way, reducing the chance of extinction ends up putting some probability onto this kind of worst case outcome, as well as obviously putting some probability on the best case outcome. If you were to try to bring about extinction, of course, that would be in some ways the safest bet of all. You know exactly what its utility is going to be. Now, it's not a great utility. It's kind of whatever the utility is of us kind of having existed up to this point and then no longer existing. I should say, sort of just as an aside in all of this, I'm kind of just, in this version of the argument, just kind of assuming that the only thing that gives kind of value to the world that we're interested in is human existence. Of course, that's not true. Animal existence, environmental existence, aesthetic things and so on have value as well. But the same argument's going to go through if you include those as well. But I'll just talk as if the only thing that gives value to a world is human existence. Okay, so the best thing you could do from the point of view of a really risk-averse individual is to bring about extinction, because that sort of says, look, we've had a run, we've got a certain amount of utility banked, the world's had this amount of utility, that's it, we know what that is. If we continue at all, even if we don't try to reduce the chance of extinction, just as long as we just keep it the same way. We don't try to intervene at all. If we just try to say, save some lives through malarial nets and so on, we'll nonetheless be leaving this possibility of the long, terrible future. And if you're risk averse enough, that's a possibility you don't want to leave open. Okay, so it turns out, in fact, that this kind of risk averse way of thinking leads you to thinking that extinction is the right thing to do. Okay, so now what do we make of all this? So one thing I say in the paper, I'll just kind of talk for another couple of minutes and just wrap this up. One of the things I want to say is that it should be at least permissible for someone who is risk averse in this way to use, or it seems, okay, so no, sorry, back up. I think there's two views you might have here. One is that when you make moral decisions on behalf of others, you just get to use your own attitudes to risk. Because if I've been talking about kind of risk averse people, I've been talking only about those. And that might suggest that I think there are only risk averse people. That's not at all true. We also get risk seeking people that are, if you've ever gone to Yosemite or something and seen people on those rock faces, there are definitely risk seeking people out in this world. So those are people, who put more weight onto the best case scenarios and less weight onto the worst case scenarios. So they take risky options because they open up to them the possibility of goodness. So you do get some risk-seeking people. You get some risk-neutral people. But it turns out that, on the whole, people are reasonably risk-averse. The group of people who, the proportion of the population that chooses in ways that are risk-averse is the larger one. Okay, but suppose anyway I am a risk-averse person. Those are my attitudes. That is how I make my decisions. You might think one thing is it's permissible then, morally permissible for me to make my decisions using those, just as it's kind of morally permissible for me to make my decisions using my subjective probabilities and my best calculation for the kind of utilities and so on. When I'm making my moral decision, I've just kind of got to go with what I have and do the best I can relative to that. So that's one possibility. You might think that. There's a stronger possibility, which I kind of float in the paper, is that, in fact, whatever your attitudes to risk are, you should choose kind of roughly in line with not the most risk averse in society, but kind of where the kind of center of gravity, if you like, is of risk attitudes. So if your society is predominantly risk averse, you should choose in a risk averse way. I mean, yeah, there are kind of there's not an awful lot to sort of justify that beyond you can give kind of examples and people's intuitions seem to kind of align with that when you're choosing on behalf of other people, making a choice that will affect other people, there seems to be a kind of bias in favor of going with the more risk averse of that group. So that might be a claim that you're in fact required to choose in line with some quite risk-averse preferences, and therefore ones that will prefer you to bring about extinction than to either just do nothing or maybe kind of do the health interventions or try to reduce the chance of extinction. So the conclusion of the paper is either you're permitted to bring about extinction if this argument works, then you're required to bring about extinction, or perhaps you're permitted to bring about extinction, or perhaps you're even required to bring about extinction. My own view, I should say, I mean, what I wanted the paper to do is to establish a conditional that really, if a certain sort of consequentialism is assumed, but it really can be pretty ecumenical in what it takes kind of the determinants of value to be. But some sort of consequentialism is correct. And if the kind of probabilities that are kind of thrown about by long-termists, thinking of Toby Ord's book or Will MacAskill's book, or some of these other estimates, Hilary Graves and Will MacAskill's paper. If those probabilities are roughly kind of in the right ballpark, then there's kind of good reason to think we should kind of make these moral decisions using these kind of risk-sensitive decision theories. And if we do that, we should their conclusions not just wrong, but entirely the opposite is true. We should try to bring about extinction rather than avoid it. So I can say I don't believe the conclusion. I don't believe that I don't, not so much actually that I deny the consequent of that conditional. I'm reasonably agnostic on it. But I thought that really that the outcome of the paper would be that the assumptions that have gone into the long-termist argument need a lot more scrutiny, because they seem to have this quite dramatic consequence. But I have to say, since writing the paper, I've learned there's a bunch of people who are reasonably pro-extinction, and so while maybe they and maybe people here will take this to be a kind of vindication of that. That's quite possible. I mean, the argument is the argument. It doesn't really matter what I think of the premises or conclusions, but I think it could be used by pro-extinctionist people as a kind of justification, or I think the better way to take it, or the right way to take it, would be you should subject the premises to a lot more searching critique. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I can. Yeah. That's half an hour. So I'll wrap up there because it'd be better to have Q&A. But if people are interested, I can talk about. Some people have raised some objections to this in the literature so far, and I can talk about those if people are interested. But I think better to hand over to questions now.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Pettigrew. That was absolutely fantastic. The first presentation, that was just extemporary, and it was really wonderful. Yeah, a fantastic overview summary of the paper, which I found to be extremely interesting contribution to the literature. So speaking of, if people have questions, they can obviously raise their hand either on Zoom or, okay, good, we've got some questions. So maybe I will start things off by asking, picking up on what you had just alluded to, that there have been some responses. So if you are not prepared to summarize like Andreas Mogenson's papered response, that's completely fine. But that's one that I'm particularly interested in, and unfortunately I did not have a chance to reread it this morning. So last time I read it was probably like several months ago. So I don't quite remember, but I remember thinking like, oh, this seems like a potentially compelling response.
Right. So I'm afraid to say that I read a draft of this and talked to Andres about it, but I'm afraid I haven't read the final one. So I may say something inaccurate about what's in the final one. But as I remember, he points to this fact about, so I'm in the paper, I use a particular decision theory that is sensitive to risk to run the argument, which is Lara Bouchak's risk-weighted expected utility theory, which is, as I mentioned, kind of built from John Quiggin's rank-dependent version. And it has a peculiarity. Let me try to see if I can reconstruct the peculiarity. In expected utility theory, suppose you are uncertain about the background level of utility that the universe holds. So a classic example of this would be, we just don't know whether there's some, system of planets miles and miles away that includes, intelligent life and is having a wonderful time, and so adding lots of lovely utility to the universe. We just don't know that. So let's assume the options are just they're there, in which case, like, they add 10 billion utiles to the universe, or they're not, in which case they add nothing. We're uncertain about that. Okay, so each of the options each of the outcomes I was talking about, where I was saying, look, there's the outcome in which humanity lasts a long time and it's wonderful, in which we, go extinct next year, in which we just kind of tumble along for 10,000 more years in a kind of mediocre way, or whether we go the bad way. Each of those outcomes now has to be divided in two. There's each outcome plus the possibility where there is this alien group that's having a wonderful time, and the possibility where there isn't this alien group having a wonderful time. Now, when you do the expected utility calculation, that just doesn't matter. Whether you can just ignore that for the purposes of doing the expected utility calculation, which option that you have, as long as that's an important thing, as long as the actions that you're thinking of will make no difference to the probabilities of those things, so that those events are independent of the outcomes relative to the actions that you take. So you giving money to bring about the end of humanity will just make no difference to those aliens having a wonderful old time. Okay, as long as you assume that, it's fine. Expected utility, you just can ignore that. And this is meant to be a nice feature of expected utility. It means that you don't have to kind of take into, you don't have to have this wildly fine-grained set of possible outcomes and so on. It makes the whole thing quite tractable. The risk-sensitive theories are often not like that. And Bushak's is one of the ones that's not like that. So it makes a difference whether you consider these two possibilities or whether you just assume that they aren't there. And Mogensen kind of points this out, and also points out that if you were to take this into account and model the outcomes in this more fine-grained way, even quite, not just the sort of fine-grainedness that I've just talked about, with just two possibilities, aliens are having a great time, there's no aliens, then you need to be a lot more risk averse in order to get my conclusion. So one feature of my conclusion is you don't just get it by being just a tiny, tiny little bit risk averse, because the thing that I said, you give more, the long-termists, and I'm granting them this, think that if you reduce the probability of extinction, you give more of the probability that you've taken off that to the long good future than you do to the long terrible future. So you need enough risk aversion to counterbalance that difference between the amount of probability you've given to the long good one versus the long terrible one. And what Andreas shows is that you just need loads more risk aversion to counterbalance that once you start fine-graining the possibilities. And of course, he only goes to two possibilities you could go to. You could be uncertain about enormous numbers, and that it may be that things go worse there. So yeah, I think that's a kind of concern. You might think there are ways of doing the kind of risk aversion that don't suffer from this particular problem that Bushak's theory has. That would be one way around this sort of thing. Or you might think that in the end it does require loads more risk aversion, but still the arguments suggest that we can be that risk averse, or perhaps that we should be that risk averse when deciding on behalf of so many other people. So that I think you're totally right. It's an excellent kind of intervention, I think, Andreas's one. But yeah, there's some ways around it, but I think we'd have to look at the details a bit more. Yeah. But in some ways, I suppose one thing I would say is in some ways that's exactly the sort of thing I wanted the paper to kind of inspire. It's like it's the doing more scrutiny of the details of this big calculation rather than just throwing expected utility theory at it and just assuming that you've got the right answer. So yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. One of my criticisms of long-termism, sort of the movement in particular, is that, particularly, especially with the publication of McCaskill's book in 2022, and consequently there being this huge push to popularize, to some might say evangelize for this long-termist worldview, is that I felt like the long-termist philosophical position itself hasn't been sufficiently developed. Like there weren't that many. So I'm agreeing with you that this is one of the reasons this is such a good paper is it is doing exactly what needs to be done, which is just scrutinize these. I mean, the last meeting, as I mentioned to you before we started, was David Thorstad talking about pessimism and how if you think there's a high probability of existential risk, then you should be less inclined to allocate our finite resources to mitigating existential risk.
Right.
So like, oh, that's totally counterintuitive. And yeah, okay. So thank you so much for that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
answer. Who else had a question? I'm forgetting who had raised their hand. Um, yes, go ahead, Dimitri.
Thank you, Emil. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the talk. It's very interesting. And I'm sorry, maybe it's a bit trite and tired question when discussing, extinctionist ideas. But I was just thinking, what if we take someone who is an ethical egoist, and they also, so they don't care about anyone's utility, they care only about their own utility, and also they're consequentialist, and also they are as risk averse as required for the consequence to follow, then does it follow that they should commit a painless suicide? You could take these three positions: so consequentialism, egoism, and reasonable risk aversion.
Yeah, I think I mean, there's quite a lot. I think that this is kind of connects quite a lot to this kind of sort of related question, whether this same style of argument kind of leads to sort of anti-natalist sort of conclusion as well, because you have the same sort of structure there, where kind of not bringing someone into existence obviously has kind of zero risk but zero upside, and then but bringing them into existence, things could go very well or could go very badly. Anyway, so there's that as well. But for the case that you're talking about, I mean, it really does depend on on the probabilities. I mean, one really nice thing about Bouchak's theory, but also these other theories, is that they're pretty nuanced. So that there was a kind of old way of doing risk aversion, which was kind of, and this is not a criticism of it because it was developed for a different purpose, but it's kind of developed in the 1950s, which didn't require probabilities at all, or wasn't sensitive to probability. So this was what's sometimes called minimax, as one of the decision rules in this framework, where what you do is you just kind of pick whatever option has the best worst case outcome. So you just care about worst case outcomes. You don't care about how likely those worst case outcomes are, anything like that. You just look at the worst case and you pick the best of the worst case. And I mean, those were actually developed explicitly in situations where probabilities weren't around. But in situations where probabilities are around, they seem way too extreme, because they're putting all of this weight onto the worst case scenario, which could have very low probability. So people like Bouchak and Quiggin and so on come along and develop theories that allow you to be sensitive to how likely the worst case outcome is, but also to stretch its probability a bit, essentially. That's not quite what happens, but you can think of it like that. Stretch its probability a bit if you're a risk-averse person, and squash the probability of the best case outcomes. In such a way that you get a different calculation. So in the case that you're talking about, it would really hugely depend on what the probabilities are. And it seems like, I mean, of course, it's just going to depend from person to person, what the kind of probability is of their future kind of going well, and what the probability is of their future being such that, it's below the threshold of a kind of minimally livable life. So I mean, so I take it for all of us, there's some probability that we end up, something happens that means that our life kind of falls below that minimum threshold. But hopefully for a lot of people, that's a low probability. And if it is, then even if you're really pretty risk averse, it's not going to get stretched enough to outweigh the kind of much more likely event that your kind of life continues going well. But I mean, yeah, so you can yeah, you run the numbers in different sorts of ways. Yeah, does that answer the question that you were?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. But I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I do think that there is that sort of thing can be a consequence for certain, but it's much more clearly a consequence that you get sort of antinatalist things. Like this is like I say, this is partly, why I say that in the end I don't really agree with the conclusion of it. And certainly if I thought that the kind of it kind of was correct, then I'd probably have to also have those kind of say it's immoral to have children or something like that, and I don't think that. So yeah. Although I mean I think it is interesting that it reflects how some people do seem to make that decision, that some people do sort of say things like, well, I've decided not to have children because I do very much worry about the kind of potential bad how that child's life might go very, very badly, and I'm too risk averse. I'm not prepared to take that risk on behalf of someone else. So, yeah. So I do think it has. Yeah, I think you're totally right to point out that it has kind of consequences beyond this debate. But yeah.
Fascinating, great. I mean, incidentally, one of the upcoming speakers who I didn't mention is Matti Hari. I think I'm saying his name right. But this is essentially it's very similar to the argument that he has made about defending his antinatalist view. So we'll discuss that more in a few maybe 2 months or something. Okay, does
That's
anybody else?
interesting.
Yeah. I mean, also just incidentally, this is a bit of a side note, but yeah, I mean, so your paper is essentially articulating a kind of pro or in a strong interpretation, a kind of pro-extinction version of long-termism. And a couple years ago, maybe 2018, I published a paper noting that you can be an antinatalist without advocating for human extinction. Maybe it's the case that there are life extension technologies in the future and so on. So just interesting kind of parallelism, I think, between these two views in terms of their counterintuitiveness. Does anybody else have questions? I'm sure people do. Please don't feel shy. Yes, Leora. I hope I'm saying that right.
Hi. Hello.
Hey.
Hi. Thanks, Richard. And yeah, thanks for the great talk and the great paper. Could you just say a bit more on why you think the risk-averse person should conclude that we should hasten the extinction of humanity rather than say something like, we should just reduce risk of suffering?
So, I mean, yeah, good. So this will not be true of all risk averse people. Okay, so you have to be sort of sufficiently risk averse for any of this stuff to kick in. But the thought is, so suppose you so what so I take it you're thinking you have these kind of possible long future kind of the sort of mediocre kind of most possible thing where we kind of trundle along without extinction, then we have possibility of extinction, then we have the kind of long, miserable future. Those are the ones I'm thinking about. And reducing S risk is kind of just actively reducing the probability of the long, miserable future. So I mean, one way to put it, I guess, is just that reducing that alone, of course, won't. If you could eliminate that, okay, so yeah, maybe this is the way to put it. If you could eliminate S risk completely, if you could reduce its probability to zero, then that would kind of be better than any of the options that we're talking about, even for the super risk averse person. In fact, this risk averse person is going to be delighted because you kind of removed it. The problem is in a situation where you can only reduce it by a certain amount is that it remains there and it's sort of, it's still getting kind of weight within this kind of risk sensitive expected utility calculation, or this risk sensitive calculation. And of course, if you were to bring about full on extinction, then it wouldn't be doing that weighting at all. And so it will just kind of depend a little bit how you run the numbers, what a particular risk averse person will be. But there will be some risk averse people who will think that keeping any possibility of it open would be worse than just kind of going with the you can kind of see it, I suppose. Think about a case where you might win £1 million, you might lose £1 million, and you've got there's kind of there's a situation where you're going to win £1 million, a situation where you're going to lose £1 million, but they're both kind of unlikely. And then the standard situation is something kind of in the middle. You kind of maybe win £1. Then if someone said, okay, but surely it'd be better to kind of reduce the probability that you lose £1 million, you'd be like, well, yeah, but it's still going to be possible, and that's still going to be kind of figuring into my calculation. So the risk averse person is going to be delighted with anything that reduces S risk. I mean, everyone's going to be delighted with anything that reduces the S risk and reduces that probability. It's just that they're going to, if they're risk averse enough, they're going to prefer that you reduce it to zero, even if reducing it to zero means also removing the possibility of the good outcome, namely by bringing about full extinction. So yeah, I mean, it's not a given that this will be that extinction will be better than that, but it will be for at least some risk averse people. Does that make sense then? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but you're totally right that there's, I mean, in the paper I only consider two possibilities. This sort of foundation that's trying to that kind of just pushes out, increases the chance of extinction, takes a little bit from each of good and bad, and one that reduces it puts a little bit onto good and bad. You're kind of considering, kind of a further intervention you might make, which just decreases the S risk, doesn't do anything else to anything else, and that's another option that you can kind of put into the decision and calculate. But yeah, at least for some risk averse people, they'll prefer extinction over that, even though they'll prefer that over the status quo for sure. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thanks so much, Leora. That was a really great question. Does anybody else have questions? Yes, Charlotte.
Okay, hi. My connection isn't great, so if that's okay, I'll keep the video off if you can hear me.
Totally fine.
Apologies
Yes.
for that. But I think, yeah, better that than me freezing halfway through the question. So great. Thanks for that talk. And that's interesting. I was wondering, I would really like to hear a bit more about sort of how should I imagine the bad outcome? I guess my, probably very, I guess just intuitively, my thought was things could go pretty bad. There could be a lot of suffering in the world, and I would still think there's all sorts of good things. There's life can be pretty bad, but still be worth living, I suppose. So, and I just thought, the way you think about the sort of badness that's involved, that might change a bit how you would assess relevant risks. And I guess I was just wondering, what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I mean, in some ways, again, I was saying wanted the paper to kind of provoke some kind of further thinking about the long-termist premises. And it's not like they haven't thought about this one, but the conclusion is so dependent on where you set that threshold for a life worth living. And it's completely kind of essential to the argument I'm giving as well, is that there's this bad possibility where there's, a long future for humanity, huge numbers of people exist, but it's really dramatically lower than dramatically worse than full extinction, namely no one existing at all past that time. And I mean, I take it you're partly kind of pointing out that you might just not think that. You might think that, human lives, it's very, very difficult for them to go so badly that they're not worth living. And I think I talk a little bit kind of fairly naively, I think, in the paper about some things that people sometimes say about just humanity existing itself might be a good that sort of, even if it doesn't make any way that it goes kind of positive in utility, it does counterbalance a lot of the bad stuff. I mean, I think this is just such a tough question. I sort of strongly feel that there are kind of clear ways in which lives might not be worth living, ones in which, say, people have no autonomy whatsoever and they're in great kind of physical suffering. I mean, I think I think there were sort of historical periods where, quite a lot of people's lives were like that, and perhaps still in parts of the world there are situations where large numbers of people are living that. So, people are under huge conditions of stress, living in pain, kind of perhaps doing very long, very difficult physical labor for long periods, suffering from horrible illnesses, that sort of thing. So the idea is that sort of thing is possible for that sort of reason. I think most parties to the debate are going to sort of accept that something like that's possible. I think two things they might deny are, one, that the badness of that, the amount that's below extinction level, is much less than the amount that the good long future is above extinction level. So you might think that there's some sort of asymmetry somehow, that things can go much better than they can go badly. The amount by which things can go well in human life is much greater than things go badly. That would really change this whole business. I don't think it wouldn't necessarily, you just need to be more risk averse in order to get the conclusion going. So that's that's one sort of thing that I think people would say. The other sort of thing is how likely that sort of thing is. So in the paper, I do make it much less likely that, I think it's like 1,000 times less likely that this long bad future comes about than it is that the long good future comes about. But you might think, because it required so much effort on my part to sort of even persuade you that there was the possibility of this long bad future, that things could really go that badly, you might think it's just very, very unlikely. There's just loads of fewer ways in which things can be that bad for people, whereas there's many, many ways in which things can be wonderfully good. I don't know if I'm kind of, either read too much dystopian stuff or, have a mind that can kind of create horrific sort of images of human life that but in some way or other, it seems to me that there are enormous numbers of ways in which people can suffer terribly. So anyway, that's the kind of. But I think you're putting your finger on exactly the kind of. I think in some ways the biggest concern about this. But I don't know what you think about it. But I'm not sure how one adjudicates this question of where that kind of zero level is, such that adding a life below that level makes the universe worse off. Adding one above it makes it better off. Yeah.
I'm not sure, but thanks so much. That's been really helpful. Great, thanks.
Thanks for your question, Charlotte. That was excellent. Richard, do you need to go now, or do you have a few more minutes? There's one more question.
5 minutes. I've got to go in 5 minutes, but other than that time.
Okay, so there's one more question here.
Oh, in the chat. Yes, I'm seeing
yes,
it, yeah.
in the chat.
Individual influence. Oh, yeah, right. Okay, so yeah, I mean, the way I put it in the paper, that the individual is controlling some large, pot of money, philanthropic pot of money to do this sort of thing. I mean, this I think is just an interesting and difficult empirical question. I mean, although an interesting, it strikes me as not terribly plausible empirical claim that Toby Ord makes in his book The Precipice is that that actually there are ways in which one can make quite a significant difference to kind of extinction risks with reasonably small amounts of money, which I guess is like the old argument from effective altruism, that you can actually do an enormous amount of good in terms of making people's lives better and indeed saving lives with not an enormous amount of money. But I think, I don't know, the ones that I've looked into where that claim is made didn't seem very plausible to me. So one of the claims he makes is that the Commission on Bioweapons or something like that is very poorly funded. But as far as I can make out, what makes that organization ineffective is not their lack of funding; it's their lack of kind of support by the countries that fund it. The money is not the issue there. The issue is political will by the various countries involved, which in some ways kind of course has to be the case. There's no way that kind of, were it not for, were it for, a couple more tens of millions, we could have a much more effective reduction, and countries wanted that, then of course they would put that money in. It's small change to them, the sort of money he's talking about. So that, yeah, it seems implausible that sort of throwing £50 million at that commission is somehow going to reduce our chance of bioweapons wiping us out by very much. So I think there is a bit of a question about how much one could shift these things. There's because the numbers are so huge in the long good future and so huge negative direction in the long bad future. Just shifting the probabilities by tiny amounts are going to make very large changes in both the expected utilities and the risk-weighted expected utilities. So you might think that even though if you're in control of like a £10 million pot, philanthropic pot, you throw it at one of these organizations that works to say kind of, reduce nuclear proliferation or make kind of ensure that nuclear warheads are not in kind of rogue hands, that sort of thing, you may be changing the probabilities by 1 in a billion, but that's enough. If we've got we've got a billion years of 10 billion people living at any given time, that's a lot of lives you get if you avoid nuclear war. And if you reduce that probability by just 1 in a billion, then, so I think, yeah, I mean, I think your point's, right on the money. I think you have, that is an important kind of empirical question. It's also very unclear how we discover these probabilities. I mean, I think that's one thing that this community has not always been great at. Not, I should say, because I think there's some methodology out there they should be using that's better. I just think this is incredibly difficult stuff to think about. So, people kind of, look to prediction markets and things like that, but with no real good evidence that they're good at the sorts of predictions that that we're talking about, with very, very small probabilities and the effectiveness of very amorphous interventions and things. So yeah, I think you're right to be worried that there might be quite a small difference you could make, but they're just going to say, yeah, but the numbers are so huge that small differences make large differences in expectation. I think the bigger worry is we don't even know what the small difference is. And to be honest, we don't even know which direction it goes in. It could easily be that giving money to this organization you think is going to reduce extinction actually increases it. We just haven't thought it through. So yeah. Okay, I actually had better pop off now, but thanks very much. And thanks for all.
Yeah, give Dr. Pettigrew like a warm digital, applause. Thank you so much for joining us. This was absolutely fantastic. It was really wonderful chatting with you, and I hope to see everybody in attendance in, I think, 2 weeks or so. So yeah, thanks again. Absolutely wonderful, and have a great day.